Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 18th of October, 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. We will be joined by live video Skype link by David Ellis from Strategic Defence Initiatives. All we're going to say on the weather is it's chilly, although there is some sunshine, and that appears to be the case across the rest of the country. Chilly winds blowing. Financial matters coming.
Chilly Willies.
If you like, Mike.
Yeah, so we're starting off with Wicked Willie himself, William Hague. Here we go. Central bankers have lost the plot, he says. I have to say, you know, there are some firsts in the news from time to time, and this has got to be a first that I'm agreeing with William Hague. As I'm about to comment on, I don't think he's changed sides at all, but we'll come on to that in a second. He said that central banks collectively have now indeed lost the plot. They're blowing up a bubble of make-believe money to avoid immediate pain, except for penalising the poor and the prudent, like doctors keeping their patients on a drip many years after an operation. They're losing credibility and producing very dangerous side effects. This follows on from criticism from Theresa May at the Tory party conference, where she was criticising sort of monetary policy from the Bank of England. Mark Carney said that he would not take instructions from politicians. But Hague here saying that central banks are going to find themselves losing their independence if they don't wise up. Like I say, William Hague hasn't suddenly changed sides. He's not suddenly one of the good guys. What this is indicative of is the state of the financial system, the state of the relationship between the financial system and politicians at the moment, as it all collapses in a big heap of muddy poo.
What a statement by Mark Carney. So we got the Bank of England just saying we are not going to take instructions from politicians. Indeed. So the scam of the Bank of England being anything to do with the nation is coming home to roost pretty quickly.
David.
Well, that's standard policy with central bankers, that they don't take instructions from politicians. I mean, so Mark Carney is actually saying it from their perspective. So he's telling everybody what the situation is. So just try and view that objectively. That is standard policy amongst all central bankers, from BIS, Bank of England, ECB. It doesn't work like that with them, you know. So maybe William Hague has actually realised this fact. I mean, it's sort of been undiscussed for so many decades now. I think the last people to discuss it was sort of within Churchill's sphere in World War II. So, you know, this is quite an alarming comment from William Hague. Very alarming on the politician's side. Don't think anything's changed on the banker's side, but on the political side, yes, this is a big step for a politician to say that.
I think it is, but I think, as I say, it's more indicative of the faction fighting within the various elites, and because we should just remember, of course, William Hague has just earned £1 million for giving speeches, so he's in the Tony Blair bracket.
It's remarkable, isn't it? You go down a water slide at a fun park with a McDonald's baseball cap on, and years later you're making millions out of speeches.
Yeah. How does that work?
I don't know. Perhaps we should give it a try. Yes. Let's book a place at Alton Towers, I suppose it would be.
So another day, another Deutsche Bank announcement, and this time it's $38 million of fines to pay for fixing the silver price. Gold and silver prices, everybody recognises that those have been fixed well and truly for a long time now, over the last 40 years anyway. So this is a settlement through the Manhattan Federal Court, just another load of money that Deutsche Bank can't really afford to lose, although it's a relatively small amount. It's not quite the $14 billion that they're getting worried about.
Actually, Mike, before you move on, are those Mujahideen warriors in front of the Deutsche Bank there?
Don't know. What can we say? Right, Royal Bank of Scotland. Well, government, of course, owned by the government. Of course, they were busy shutting down RT's bank accounts yesterday. At least one of their subsidiaries was. Royal Bank of Scotland, owned by the government. But unfortunately, by the time we sell the shares for this bank, we're going to be getting significantly less than was expected. So the current value of the government's holding is £14.8 billion. The government estimates that it's worth £21.5 billion. That's quite a bit of a difference. So the Office for Budget Responsibility making the point that, in fact, this is going to create a £6 to £7 billion hole in government finances. But of course, it doesn't really make any difference whatsoever to the overall debt. Well, this is 2015 figures. That was 1.56 trillion of debt. Despite all the yelling from the government that we're going to start paying this down, of course, it's only got bigger. So it's currently at about 1.6 trillion. Well, there you go. Royal Bank of Scotland sale of their shares isn't going to help much.
Okay. Well, I thought I'd just add to that. This one, which we covered some time ago, but I thought it was very pertinent. This is the Blavatnik School of Government. So this is, of course, tied in with University of Oxford. We have so many of these funny little think tanks. They're all independent. They're full of people who can teach us how to do things better than we might know ourselves. But I thought we'd remind people that when we went looking, we just happened to find that Mr. Mark Carnage was in there himself. So on one hand, he says they're not going to take instructions from politicians. On the other hand, he's embedded in the Blavatnik School of Government in Oxford, teaching other people how to govern the nation, alongside Bill Clinton, I think, was the person.
Next photograph.
The next photograph, yeah. So how does this happen? I don't know. David, do you want any final comment on the bankers? One of the things I'm interested in is, did Theresa May go to Switzerland before she assumed Prime Minister's office in order to get a briefing from the Bank of International Settlements? There were several people suggested this.
Well, it's certainly a valid question. And in terms of the protocol at the BIS, the politicians are not allowed in, and they are not regarded, and it's generally accepted that the political class, establishment, whatever you want to call them, or interface, or ministers or whoever, are viewed from the central bankers as not having capable intellect to be a central banker. Therefore, they're of lesser capability. So the instructions, you can see how the instructions or the command chain actually works. It works from in terms of those that control the money tell the politicians what they're going to be doing. So Mark Carney and all the rest of them that are making these sorts of comments, they're being from their point of view truthful and honest. This is how it is. But unfortunately for the general public, the majority of the general public don't understand just how that relationship works, how it interfaces them with the people, and how policy is actually flowed in terms of following the money, finding the policy, and then vice versa. So that's the, you know, whether she was over there getting instructions. I find it rather ironic, really, because that's where Lenin was supposed to be on the night of the Russian Revolution breaking out, but he didn't. He was summoned apparently, but didn't attend and went back to Russia. So one can certainly look at this. A lot of circumstantial factors there with Theresa May's visit. So perhaps that's a question we need to sort of ask her personally, but I have no idea how we would go about that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. We'll leave that as supposition at the moment. Let's focus on the reality of the crowing Western media, because Russia Today has had a letter from the National Westminster Bank saying that they're going to close their accounts in December. They don't want to discuss it. There's no ifs or buts. It's going to happen. And we decided just to pick up on The Guardian to see the I'm lost for words again, but just the disgraceful commentary from British newspapers over what's been going on. So if we have a look at the meat, this is the opening of the Guardian article. Closure of Russia Today's bank accounts, nothing to do with us, says the Treasury. And this is, we're going to add to this graphic, so we just hold it on screen, please. But this is the opening statement from the Guardian that they went to the Treasury to say to the Treasury, did you have anything to do with the the order to close Russia Today's bank account, and the Treasury said to them, no, it wasn't us, we didn't do anything. And the Guardian didn't bother to go to MI5, which might have put in some media pressure.
Or the Foreign Office.
Or the Foreign Office to put in some media. Well, actually, there was a bit of comment from them, Mike, but this was the thing. We spoke to the Treasury and they said we didn't do it, so the Guardian reports that as truth. So let's just go through it. What did the Guardian say? The Treasury had nothing to do with NatWest's move. Russia Today became more and more about painting a negative picture of the West. That nasty Russia Today channel, it's nothing like British newspapers and media painting a negative picture of Russia. Russia Today started to paint a negative picture of the West. That's terrible. And on it goes. And I've taken quite a bit because I think it's important. This is about truth. Often questioning more, which of course is the little logo, part of the logo for Russia Today, often questioning more meant wallowing in conspiracy theory, giving airtime to 9/11 truthers and other basement bloggers. Away from the lunatic fringes, the channel often covered the same kind of stories in Britain and the US as The Guardian might. It focused on injustice and official malpractice and social tensions and political demonstrations. So there's The Guardian. Oh, you can trust us because we've been focusing on injustice. Of course, they're not reporting anything about child abuse. They're not reporting criminality in Westminster. But this is their own propaganda spewing out on the back of the Russia Today story. Especially in the US, the channel built up a following for touching the kind of issues that many mainstream networks did not. So now we're coming into the meat of it. The Russia Today actually became successful in reporting issues that The Guardian wouldn't report, but they don't seem to get the significance, or perhaps they do. And then in comes the dagger. During the annexation of Crimea, Russia Today complained about misinformation from the West. Well, that all seems pretty appropriate because if we follow it through, Russia Today has portrayed Russia's military intervention in Syria as a campaign against terrorists. What an outrageous statement, Mike. Terrible. And reflects Moscow's official position that no civilians have been killed by Russian jets. Well, I'd like The Guardian to substantiate that because I haven't seen that. And I don't think that even Moscow would be stupid enough to say that they can be conducting military operations with no risks to civilians. But here's the dagger from The Guardian, pure propaganda coming in from the other side. And here he is. This is for you, Mike, obviously. David Clark, a former Foreign Office advisor and the chair of the Russia Foundation, said the BBC's office in Moscow could now be in the front line for possible Kremlin reprisals.
That would be a shame.
That would be a shame. But the BBC is the flagship British broadcaster. It's a public body, but in the Russian mind, it's an arm of the state, and they see it as a proxy. They will look at kicking British journalists out of Russia. Nobody in UK thinks that the BBC is perhaps a government broadcaster then. Just those Russians.
Must be.
Yeah.
I must be Russian.
And here's the question more. Russia Today is trying to sow confusion and to create a climate of intellectual pessimism and nihilism by mixing the genre of news and outright fabrication. This is precisely what The Guardian and the BBC and many other newspapers are doing in the UK, and they're trying to put it on Russia. David, I'm going to stop at this point because this is such blatant nonsense and propaganda by The Guardian, of course, trying to claim the moral high ground. We've been deluded by our own press and media for a very long time. Is this the opportunity to take the lid off what's going on in UK?
Yeah, it most certainly is. I mean, I've just sort of viewed it with crikey, you know. I mean, that it's just all right. Well, only we're allowed to do the propaganda. You possibly couldn't even do any propaganda, and let alone, heaven forbid, reporting some home truths. We can't have that. I mean, we've seen 100 years now of Russia bashing and sexed up anti-Russian reports and fabricated nonsense, much the same as what we saw with Blair in Iraq, completely sexed up nonsense, and of course the realities are very, very different. And as we said on the last show, if Russia was so bad, why have successive British governments smashed our military, obliterated our military and our industry to the degree that they have? So the argument doesn't stack up. And the general public are seeing through it, and that's the point: is that that Russia Today were offering a very alternative, and let's be honest about it. They were offering an objective news. Certainly, we're not getting it in the UK. We're not getting what we should be getting because they can't, can they? It's a stitch up. So it's almost really. I think this is a bit like when the BBC banned Frankie Goes to Hollywood's Relax single. It went straight to the top. It got a lot of media attention. It stayed at number one for quite some time. So probably this is what's going to happen with RT, that they'll actually come out on top with this.
Okay. Well, we just had a bit more, and of course we have to bring in the bank. So let's bring in the boss of RBS. Here he is, Mr. Ross McEwen. Now, I took this article, was actually RBS business chief seeks to rebuild the bank's battered reputation. I thought this was a good place to start. So, of course, RBS owns the NatWest, and the NatWest then says it's going to pull Russia Today's funding effectively, or its banking facility. When the NatWest was questioned about why they were doing this, they did eventually produce a statement. But it took actually about 6 hours to come out of the system. I would guess that's because NatWest had to actually make contact with your Foreign Office, Mike, and agree what the party line was, and then the statement comes out. But if we follow through the reporters from that Guardian article, it gets even more interesting. There was two of them. This is the first one, Luke Harding. And he said in that Guardian article we just looked at, during the annexation of Crimea, RT did not report on the Russian soldiers deployed on the peninsula and complained about misinformation from Western media outlets, which said that Russian forces were present. So those despicable Russians, they didn't report something, and they dared to complain about Western reporting. And so Luke clearly got his underwear in a twist about this. But I was very intrigued to find an interesting site called offguardian.org, which featured this man, kindly provided this photograph. And in it, it said under Crimea and Ukraine, Luke Harding goes off his meds because he basically tweeted out, Russia now accusing Ukraine of armed Crimea insurrection, classic fakery, but to what end? And the point they made is that they asked him to evidence his claim that this was fakery, but there was no response. So they said he did not provide evidence for his assertion, but then evidence isn't really Luke's thing. So somebody else picking up this man and saying, who is he and what's the quality of his journalism? Well, this is his friend in the article. This is Sean Walker. He is an interesting man. He's the Guardian Moscow's reporter, but I don't know what he does exactly. He tweets a lot. He said it seems that freedom of speech is completely lost in Albion's Russophobic fog. That was a statement that came out of Russia Today, because they're saying it's clear freedom of speech has gone in UK. Russia Today is correct. And he answers the platonic ideal of a Russian official quote about the UK. I'm not actually sure what that means, Mike. I don't know what you'd get from that.
Nonsense.
Nonsense, that's what I thought. Most of his Twitter page is nonsense, but this is the quality of journalism from The Guardian, from Moscow. And if we just continue on the subject of The Guardian, because it's an important one, let's not remember it was The Guardian printing this untruth about Millie Dowler's voicemail being hacked. That was all part of the enormous spin to create the hacked off and to put the pressure through the system to get Lord Leveson's inquiry up and running with the help of Common Purpose, funded by Deutsche Bank, amongst others. What was the objective? To get greater government control of the British press and media. And just so that we get the right information on screen, one of the key things that UK Column was able to expose was that, of course, behind the Media Standards Trust driving for Leveson's clampdown on the press, we had The Guardian, and we pointed out that we had the Scott Trust, of course, running the Guardian Media Group. And if you dig into them, you're quickly into links through to the Rothschild banking dynasty. So it doesn't take much to say, is The Guardian independent? We don't think so. Does The Guardian get facts wrong? We think they do. Are they pretty good at British government propaganda themselves? We think they probably are. And we'll just leave you on this one, because if you have a little look on the Guardian website, you'll find that they were very good at exposing the lies, myths and half-truths of anything to do with the EU referendum, Mike.
With some useful explainers. It should also be noticed, of course, that the Guardian appears to people to be mainly a news website, but in fact the news website is only a small fraction of what the Guardian does. And if we're looking at how this country is being transformed, as they like to say, constitutionally, and the rise of civil society in this country as one of the mechanisms of governance. Of course, The Guardian is running all these networks. They've got various civil society networks as part of their website. So we've got the common purpose networks operating throughout society, and The Guardian is providing a lot of the IT infrastructure that they need to operate.
That's absolutely correct. So those social networks behind big society, driven by the Guardian networks, but the Guardian claims it's independent of British government. I think we're going to support Russia today on this one.
Indeed. Well, the Brexit fiasco continues. We mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, but this is just starting to build momentum. So a number of so-called senior MPs speaking out on the issue of whether the referendum for leaving the EU should be allowed to continue, whether Theresa May should be allowed to continue with the Brexit process, or whether there should be a vote in Parliament about it. This is all about what's being described as the sovereignty of Parliament. The fact that because they demand that there is such a thing as the sovereignty of Parliament, that referendums are not legally binding, they're therefore advisory, and they're saying that David Cameron had agreed that in 2010. And therefore it should apply today. Nicky Morgan speaking out, Dominic Grieve speaking out, Kenneth Clarke speaking out on this. He had to say constitutionally this situation must be correct because referendums never played a part in British politics before Harold Wilson called his European referendum. And it's sensible because a referendum on a big, broad question tells us nothing about the dozens of issues that have to be tackled by the government in response to it.
So let me get that right. A referendum in order to get us in is okay, but a referendum to get us out is not okay.
That's pretty much it. Yes.
Okay, and this will be the same Ken Clarke that doesn't want to look into constitutional issues around child abuse, for example.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, well, we say that the UK is now a lawless state, and we're going to encourage people to come to the Winchester British Constitution Group conference on the 19th of November, and that is all about reasserting the rule of law. One of our key guest speaker is going to be Vanessa Beeley. Of course, this is the very brave lady that's been going into Syria in order to meet the real people, in order to report the truth about what's going on in Syria that's not being reported by the BBC or The Guardian, as just two examples. So if you haven't watched Mike's work with Vanessa Beeley, and of course Patrick Henningsen, a very big part of that as well, have a look on the UK Column website. But if you come along to the British Constitution, British Constitution Group meeting on the 19th of November, then you've got an opportunity of hearing Vanessa speak in person, and I'm sure you may also have the opportunity of having a chat with her. So we just say once again that the important thing is, if you're getting very concerned, as many people are, about what's happening in UK, as we see our government increasingly turn to criminal activity, we need to bring good people together, and you should start a network, keep it light-hearted, and have a coffee together.
Right. Unaccompanied children. Well, this has hit the news today. It's taking a pretty dark turn, in my opinion, if it could get any darker than it was already. Of course, we've been talking about this extensively over the last several months because of the number of unaccompanied children that have disappeared in this country since they were brought here. So the most of the mainstream press, right across the press, they were discussing this today. The first group of unaccompanied children arriving from Calais, because they're taking down the Calais camp. And this is following, the government says, the Home Secretary's pledge to transfer as many minors as possible before the camp is cleared. So this group, they say, were aged between 14 and 17. They were taken across the channel this morning, and they were screened and processed by the Home Office. Well, they're saying that more children are due to arrive from France. And a Home Office spokesperson said, "We can confirm a group of children who left Calais camp this morning have arrived in the UK. This is the start of the process of transfer as many eligible children as possible before the start of the clearance." And so it goes on. These children between 14 and 17, they say, and they're going to be handed over to families that are already here. So, of course, the mainstream press covered this widely. The first Calais children, in inverted commas, arrive in Britain. Migrants who claim to be aged 14 to 17 are reunited with their families in the UK as French prepare to demolish jungle camp. And we started seeing images like this. This apparently is a 14-year-old dressed in a grey hoodie and jogging bottoms, escorted by Home Office officials in Croydon. This is one that's doing the rounds of the Twitter sphere because this is another youngster. Does he look like a youngster, Brian?
Well, the answer to that is no, although I was going to say he looks older than the politician we had on the other day.
Right.
But he certainly doesn't look a youngster now.
This is the point. So then we go on. UK Border Force staff escort the first group of unaccompanied minors. And this guy is supposed to be 14 to 17.
Yeah, right.
And so it goes on. And this guy looks like he's 40, never mind 14.
Yeah.
So, of course, this has had a huge reaction on the Twitter sphere. People going mad because these photographs are showing these unaccompanied minors, and they're saying that these are terrorists coming into the country and all this kind of thing. This, to me, is, these photographs are absolutely staged. There's no question about that. And so if people are getting wound up about whether these are young children coming into this country or whether they are older people masquerading as unaccompanied children coming into this country, we'll just think of the effect that has. First of all, it starts winding people up, making people fearful about terrorists coming into the country. Second of all, what it absolutely does is completely undermine any kind of pressure on politicians, including Tim Farron and others, about the fate of genuine unaccompanied minors coming into this country. What happens when they get into the care system? They disappear out of the care system, into sexual slavery, into other kinds of slavery. This, of course, is a big topic for Theresa May this week. She's been talking about it extensively. She mentioned it at the Tory party conference. She said that her biggest worry in life was child sexual abuse and slavery. She's doing nothing about it, and this is absolutely a staged story which the mainstream media are running right across every newspaper in order to wind people up and divert attention away from the issue of children disappearing through the system into trafficking networks.
So we call it what it is, Mike. This is more propaganda. However slight the form, this is propaganda. Exactly the same sort of propaganda that Russia today is warning is going on and being used against Russia or against Syria itself.
But it's being used against us.
Being used against us in UK.
There was one image on the Daily Mail article which perhaps is a bit more likely. We've actually got a girl in it, for example, as well. And these at least two of them look significantly younger than the other photographs. But I think we've got to be pretty careful and pretty discerning about what we see in the mainstream press and start asking questions before we start just pushing out stuff over Twitter, which is pretty inflammatory.
Yeah. Perhaps we can just ask David on this one. You are based in the Midlands and passions are running very high at this sort of thing. Our warning is that what would the British government like? Trouble on the streets, because then they can bring in more draconian clampdown measures. What's your feel about how the public see this in the Midlands?
There's certainly no matter what sort of conversation topic or subject you seem to start with, it seems to go very, very quickly into we the people or the general public, sort of saying, complete unhappy, etc., etc. And a lot of people ask me that question: do you anticipate civil unrest with all these sorts of problems when effectively the public could get to a point where it would balk? So it's a difficult one to answer, because it really depends on the mood of the British, and we're incredibly slow to rise. But I've got to say that would be the worst possible outcome, because those sorts of things in Great Britain never fare very well. We look at the miners; they fared terribly unwell under it. We look at Wat Tyler with his attempt in the Middle Ages. All those people were effectively then rounded up and executed. The same then happened under Henry VIII's rule. These sorts of things never go well in this country. So we've got a system, and the system is we assert our rights and we get our elected representatives to do their job. Now that's incredibly difficult, but there is one but with this. We were told by Charles I exactly what was expected of us, and that is that democracy expects the exceptional from the people, from the ordinary. So there's your instructions, everyone. You've all got to be exceptional. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Okay. EU foreign ministers meeting then. That happened yesterday. It began yesterday. Boris was there. And they really were pushing for, or at least he was over there pushing for sanctions on Russia over its role in Syria. But unfortunately, in his quiet backroom meetings, he doesn't seem to have been able to get the support for it. So anyway, what was he saying? Before he went, he was saying we will be discussing how to keep pressure up on the Assad regime and on its puppeteers in the form of the Russian government. And he said, but let's not forget about the Iranians. We got to keep banging on about the Iranians because they are just as bad. And so
this is Conservative Friends of Israel policy, Mike, coming out here. If you follow it through, absolutely. You can just tick this stuff off. So,
yes, absolutely. Now, as I say, he didn't get support from Europe, and here's Federica Mogherini, who's effectively the EU foreign minister. That's not really her title, but she's certainly in charge of foreign affairs in the EU. And she said that basically sanctions on Russia have not been proposed by any member state. So Boris couldn't get any support in the back room, so he didn't make it a formal request. But we have sanctions on the Syrian regime, and there are discussions on that for sure. Well, they were pushing absolutely for Russia to do something about Aleppo. The situation deteriorating in Aleppo, escalating violence, causing untold and unacceptable suffering is what they were saying. They said that the Syrian regime has primary responsibility for protecting the Syrian population. The EU therefore strongly condemns the excessive and disproportionate attacks by the regime and its allies, both deliberate and indiscriminate. And so it went on. In these deteriorating circumstances, the EU urgently calls for an end to all military flights over Aleppo city. So that was the type of language that was coming out of the EU foreign ministers meeting yesterday. And so the Russians basically said, right, okay then, we'll do that. So it came from the EU. It also came from New Zealand. So this is Vitaly Churkin, who's the Russian ambassador to the United Nations. And he took note of a draft resolution in the UN from New Zealand. He said this is an interesting effort, and I think that we can definitely consider it. I hope that they will be persistent in their efforts. And so what they were proposing was withdrawal of insurgents from eastern Aleppo in compliance with the UN Secretary General's special envoy to Syria, that's de Mistura. The MPs that were talking about this the other day kept quoting Stefan de Mistura, but they weren't really supporting him. New Zealand has decided they're going to support him. They've put a draft resolution into the UN. Russia said, okay, no problem. And they said today that they were going to have an 8-hour ceasefire. They think that a longer pause, 48 or 72 hours, would require some mutual agreements. But what they then went on to say was that they would be setting up corridors for civilians to leave eastern Aleppo, and also the withdrawal of militants if they wanted to leave. So they're going to allow people out. At the moment, it's only an 8-hour ceasefire, but with some agreement from other parties. Probably we're talking the UK and the United States here. That could be extended to 48 or 72 hours. So basically, once again, Russia is calling the West bluff. The European Union foreign ministers meeting and the comments that we've made or that we've highlighted over the last couple of days from the UK ambassador to the United Nations, criticizing Russia left, right, and centre. Well, Russia has once again said, okay, guys, we'll do what you ask. Now, basically, put up or shut up is really what's going on.
Yeah, so Russia's calling for ceasefires and obviously has the capability with help to make that happen. What happens in Britain? Russia today gets their bank accounts closed down because we wouldn't want too much alternative media on the subject of Syria coming into the country. It's pretty easy to spot. Well, we're just going to say, against that background, it's interesting to have a look at what's been happening to the British military. And David Ellis, of course, has picked up on that. I'm just going to introduce the subject of the continued military integration into the EU. And we've got Major General Robert McGowan, the gentleman on the left in this picture. Well, he's been popping over to Potsdam. And he's very big on tweeting. So here's the tweet today. I'm in Potsdam in Germany discussing the future of our EU operations with my fellow op and mission commanders, EU NAV4 and Op Atlanta. Now, most of this is tied in with the fact that it requires the whole of the European armed forces in order to deal with a few pirates out in the Far East. These people are apparently so powerful it requires joint naval operations. Personally, I don't believe a word of it. But David, you've got some other comments on the significance of the General's visit to Potsdam.
Yes, it followed the week previous, obviously, Mike Fallon being over with German minister and agreeing to enhanced defence union with the Germans. So taking that conjoined with the fact that we've already got a defence union with the French, what we've effectively got is a kind of bridgehead or a series of stepping stones into full EU military union. So that seems to be the position as Fallon left it by making those comments that he made. Now, immediately what happened after that is Major General McGowan here has gone over to Potsdam and they've had a meeting there with the rest of the top brass. You can see some senior officers there from across the EU zone, from all sorts of looking as if they're heads of service of their own country. So why are they in Potsdam? We've got to ask the question that is there a already existing EU military command and control centre headquarters already there? And is it built? Is it constructed? Did they agree to activate? That being the case, did they agree at that meeting post Fallon's comments on enhanced defence union? Did all those officers actually establish that HQ to go into operation? So those are the questions that we're sort of seeing in terms of those sequence of events coming out of it.
So, David, we had these European headquarters were set up very quietly over the last, 5 or more years. So the public in UK simply not told about it, but new joint EU headquarters set up. We're now seeing the Potsdam one being used despite the fact that Britain is supposed to be withdrawing from the European Union. UK column, with your help, has exposed what was going on down at RAF St Morgan in Cornwall, where we had an extremely large European HQ set up, particularly with efforts from the French. And we know that inside the Northwood London HQ, that similar European Union command and control facilities were set up. Public was not told about this at the time, but now at the very time we're supposed to be leaving the European Union, this command and control structure is being activated and Britain's armed forces are being sucked in even further. This is the reality of what's going on, surely.
Well, surely that is. I mean, if you're to take Fallon's comments on face value, that there's a considerable amount of intertwining there with our, sovereign Her Majesty's Armed Forces being intertwined with other states, with the view to being a full EU, union of military union, and they're now calling it defence union. So perhaps I got a bit fidgety with the original phraseology, but nonetheless, this is an absolute fundamental requirement from the prescribed ascent pathway for the EU to become a state, that it would have to have currency union, it would have to have military union. The military union would then trigger it being able to establish a treasury. Everybody would then get a tax bill for that, and it would become a state, and it would have its government in the fashion that it's been designed to have it. So it's a very, very important aspect. It's a very important key objective of the EU. And it's not been debated properly. It's not in the mainstream press. It's not in any of the parties. Most of the parties run a mile as soon as you start to talk about this. And most of the MPs I've interfaced with literally run away from you because they know the general public would balk at the thought of going into military union with the EU. And that's what appears to be happening. But of course, it's political suicide. Nobody will put it in a manifesto. Nobody will talk about it and actually have a vote on the thing. So, what we're seeing here is very, very worrying, because what it means, of course, is with military union, the EU can have budgetary union. And that's from capital procurement budgets. So that will affect our industry, our jobs, our family, your way of life. And it will then be operational budgets. So once it gets to decide what the operational budget is, it will decide where the military goes, internal or external, and what it does. Now, we've always said for some years now, in conjoined with you guys there, that Syria would be the lever for this. And talking up the war with Russia, of course, helps that cause. It assists the EU to get this. So, as I've said to a lot of the generals and admirals with regard to this, that are ex-service, not in service, that the most logical outcome of an exacerbation in Syria or against Russia or another front that opens up somewhere else, heaven forbid, is the outcome would be the formation of military union. That looks like what the EU are driving for here with this little gem from Magawan, thank you very much, on what's happened here in Potsdam.
Yeah.
So we all need to get our pens and paper out. We all need to pick up the phones and start asking our MPs what on earth is going on.
David, thank you for that. Well, we just add in another part of that picture because, of course, while we've got Boris Johnson and other people warning of the terrible threat from Russia, not only on a world stage but within Syria, this was UK column reporting back in June last year. And what are we saying? $500 million is being cut from the defence budget and savings that George Osborne was supposedly making. So we were told just a year ago that nobody really understood anything was happening in Russia, and therefore it was safe to start cutting our military. Of course, those cuts we now know were designed to make sure that Britain's military couldn't stand alone, and this subversive integration with the European Union would have to take place. And we'll emphasise it with this report from June as well. We were reporting on the comments by Brigadier General Peter Zwack from the US Army, retired, and he says that he was warning at the time of the West policy with Russia. So he was blaming the West for starting to get in very dangerous territory with the Russians. He wanted a proper dialogue. He said we need to get the forces standing back from each other. What we've seen on the contrary is NATO in particular pushing forces right up to the borders. And he said there needs to be a defusing of aggressive EU policy. And Mike, you're telling us that they're having meetings to see if they can put more pressure on Russia over Syria as a minimum. And we also highlighted that in the background, we'd got key people, Oliver Letwin and Francis Maud, who were driving this policy through. And it was clear that David Cameron, as Prime Minister, was just completely out of the loop. And the other part of the jigsaw was the fact that you were kind enough to flag up for us that there was an attack coming on British Aerospace in order to get that company taken over, most likely by American military firms. And the idea of that was that we have no ability as a nation state to arm our own armed forces. In view of what we're now starting to see happen with the banks and the financial markets, would you like to just add a bit on how you see the picture with Lockheed Martin and British Aerospace at the moment?
Yeah, let me first comment on Peter Zwack. He's a very long-standing, very well-considered, very well-read. His appreciation and regard for history is immense. I've had some dialogue with him when he was a defense attaché out in Moscow, and the guy knows what he's talking about. And his primary concern at the time was the established pathways and meetings and correspondence that used to occur with the United States, NATO, and Russia were being collapsed and shut down. And he viewed it as being exceptionally dangerous, and that was not the right way to be going. So you can see what the initial steps were by the Western governments. His advice was probably linear with ours, and certainly then concurred with a lot of our old admirals and generals. Very quickly after the Sochi Games, he was retired, post some interaction with John Kerry. So if for those of you who are interested, this guy really talks sense. You know, he really does talk sense. His primary concern is humanity, is the safety of humanity. He's on Twitter to capital P, capital Z, Peter Zwack. Link up, follow him, tweet him, offer him some support. He's going around trying to actually, you know, talk about the right stuff. So close loop with him. On the BAE front, if there's what we'll see if we're right about our analysis was this, is that very soon there'll be some capital procurement announcements on an EU basis, and we'll see that impact the money flows and policy flows as to how that affects our industry and our capital procurement budgets, and that will cannot only but go one way and have some kind of effect upon BAE, Rolls-Royce, Babcock, and all the other key players. So there's going to be some changes very soon to that if the other pathway continues. So you know, not good. We need to be able to make washers and nuts and bolts in this country, and we're going the wrong way with it all. It's not good. If you look at the way that the EU SDSR cut to join program, it wouldn't be correct to say decimated engineering in the Midlands, because that would be 1 in 10. What it did was obliterate it.
Okay, we'll pause on that note of truth. We're going to end on the subject of UKIP. We've had resignation by Stephen Wolfe, and this has been picked up by the Telegraph, saying that basically UKIP is in a death spiral. This would have been a good man to lead. He's leaving, and the report is that UKIP is in chaos. Now, this is a subject which, whenever we talk about UKIP, viewers and listeners to UK columns, some of them at least, get a bit twitchy. We're going to stick to our guns. We consistently said and warned that Nigel Farage would lead UKIP into a cul-de-sac, which would end in disaster. They're now in that cul-de-sac. If we can just pop that one back on screen, please, Theo. What I wanted to say really echoes what David has said. What's the solution to what's going on with UKIP? Well, the rank and file of UKIP need to act independently of their failed UKIP party leadership. They've got to expose the true state of the United Kingdom, which is that it has now become a corrupt, lawless state run by a lawless parliament. And those UKIP, the rank and file body of the UKIP church, need to re-engage with their 14 million voters and win more millions from all the people who are suffering under this regime. It's time for ordinary UKIP supporters to leave their leadership and start to act as individuals, which is exactly what David Ellis has just told us. We need ordinary people to stand up and be counted and to act in an exceptional way. So there's the solution. But we're going to say we warned and warned where UKIP would be taken by Nigel Farage, and that is a disastrous cul-de-sac just at the time when all of those 4 million voters should be working to get us out of Europe and to get law and order restored in Britain. David, thank you very much for joining us. That's the end of today's news. We will be back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.